Welcome to the road where the night never ended, where the wind kept its own cruel clock and the snow erased every footprint except hers. Welcome to a strip of frozen earth that tested men broke wagers and swallowed lantern light whole, and yet somehow the mail still arrived. A black woman in a long coat steps into the storm like a metronome against doubt. Breath. A white ghost boots drumming a vow the town refused to hear. They said the route would stop, she didn't. They said the weather would win, she wouldn't. They said the night would bury her name, she carried it forward in other people's letters. Listen. Closer. The envelopes whisper as they rub together inside the leather bag, a rustle like dry leaves, a chorus of names. The ledger misfiled and the saloon mocked. There's the scent of cold iron from the hinges of a post office door, the rasp of twine biting into brown paper, the faint ring of a bell that no longer hangs, echoes from a town that bet its pride against her patience and lost. On the horizon, telegraph poles march into the dark like a silent regiment. Each line hums a secret, each knot remembers a hand that tied it tight. She keeps walking, past windows that shudder when her shadow passes, past jokes that wilt when she doesn't stop, past a line in the snow that might have been the end of the road if she had believed in ends. Welcome to the hour the maps forgot. An hour held together by a woman's steady gait and a sack of brittle promises that would have meant nothing if she hadn't delivered them. Hear the leather creak, old faithful, unforgiving. Hear the fabric of her sleeves stiffen with frost. Hear the storm breathe in and hold as if surprised she is still moving. The town will call this grit. The papers will call it unusual. The bets will call it impossible. She will call it Tuesday. Before we begin, breathe with her. Count the steps. Feel the sting on your cheek that isn't there. And then lend your witness. Tell us where you're watching from and the exact minute on your clock right now. Drop it in the comments so this road, this impossible road, can thread through your city, your room, your night. If you've ever carried something no one believed in, say so. If you've ever walked through weather meant to stop you, say where. Tonight we gather names the wind tried to scatter, and we spell them out loud together. Welcome to the route that didn't end because she didn't. January 1895. Cascade, Montana. A hard little town with a colder sky. False fronts along Front Street, plank sidewalks glazed with ice, a freight sled creaking past the general store, and a wind that made language short. The river moved slow steel under frost, while telegraph poles paced the horizon like tired sentries. Smoke from stovepipes leaned east the way a body leans when it's walked too far. Horses stamped. Doors breathed sawdust and heat. You could hear leather talk, bridles, boots, the old grammar of a place that still thought survival was a good day's work. And not a promise. This is where she worked, and where the town worked on her. A woman, black, broad-shouldered, with a laugh that cut through tavern talk and a stare that made small bets look smaller. The papers would reduce her to 2 words catchy as a headline, Stagecoach Mary. But tonight we hold the longer sentence. Before that name there was labor without applause. Before applause there was suspicion. Before suspicion there was the simple problem of a road that needed to be traveled, in weather that didn't want company. Out beyond the town's last hitching post west and northwest toward St. Peter's Mission, the land opened honest as a ledger. And just as unforgiving. Coolies and cottonwoods. Fence-lines that started confident and ended unsure. Snow that flattened different field trail mistake into the same chalky page. By day the route was distances and fences. By night it was a rumor of the same. If you squinted from a porch, you could sometimes see a figure crossing the white, a small faith moving steadily against the wind. Reconstruction had ended in the South on paper and then in practice, and the nation had learned a new trick to forget with a straight face. Jim Crow bled down county lines like ink spilled on a map. New laws rehearsed old intentions. Separate was taught as a synonym for shrinking. Yet the West Montana in 1895 sold itself as a future with fewer walls. And maybe that was a fairy tale. Maybe a loophole. Maybe just a colder bargain. People came anyway. Ex-soldiers with stories they only told when the stove burned hot. Homesteaders who planted hope the way you plant a flag too soon and too proud. Nuns with ledgers and patience. Black laborers who wanted the same thing as wind wants from grass room to pass through without being stopped. She had arrived years earlier. Mary Plain first working at St. Peter's Mission for the Ursuline sisters. Hauling freight, chopping wood, fixing what winter broke, and winter breaks everything. Local boys learned to stand up straighter when she walked by. Local men learned that some arguments ended at her eyeline. There were whispers. Always whispers about a temper, about a habit of settling accounts immediately, about a palate for cigars and a taste for freedom. But the sisters wrote in calmer ink, reliable, strong, generous. And then after a dispute that was more about order than justice, the mission and Mary parted. Cascade took the echo. The U.S. Post Office in those years leaned on what it called star routes mail carried by contractors who won bids, then won the weather, then tried to win the clock. No locust cloud of regulations, no soft cushion of rescue, just a promise written in triplicate and a schedule that did not care who you were. The bid line for Cascade to St. Peter's was a dare disguised as arithmetic. Men did the math. She did the miles. When Mary Fields passed 60, all tendon and will put in for the contract, the town broke into its natural dialect jokes first, then disbelief, then the kind of fear that dresses as advice. But every place has at least one habit worth saving. And Cascade, for all its short allowances, still knew how to recognize work when it passed by. Listen to the room where the contract was signed, the scratch of a pen, the rustle of a page. How men look at one another when a fact changes shape in front of them. We'll see, someone said. Every frontier story has a we'll see. But the road had been waiting for a body that could keep promises, and she had one. She outfitted what she needed: a team when teams made sense. A sleigh when wheels lied. A sled when sleighs lied. And on the worst nights, nothing but boots, a wrapped parcel against the heart, and the stubborn idea that people deserved to hear their names spoken at their own doors. Cascade's mornings began with bets and ended the same. Would she make it today through this, through that, through the thing that took the last man off the route? The barroom liked its odds. The schoolhouse liked its mail. And between them stood a woman who couldn't afford to talk about either. At the boarding house, she paid up front. At the stable, she overtipped. In the mercantile, she bought the same hard candy for children whose last names the ledger taught her first. She gave away more than she kept time, mostly. Patience, often. And on one memory-still night, the only dry scarf in the county. Now picture the street at 6 a.m. Lamplight dying into blue wagon wheels, biting ice breath, steam swirling into something like handwriting. She checks the harness once, then again the way people check a promise they're about to keep. The postmaster nods without ceremony. The ledger closes patient as a held breath. And the leather bag, stitched and restitched, settles over her shoulder with the familiar complaint of old work. Names inside: soldiers on garrison. Pay a mother waiting on a letter that was already late before it was sealed, a shopkeep who ordered hope by catalog and got back-ordered dreams instead. You learn things carrying another person's news. You learn what a town is without asking. And always the weather, that recurring character with no face and many hands. Chinook winds could lift a day like a curtain and then drop it back down, wrong side out. A sky that promised mercy at noon could turn to a lesson by 2. Snow wasn't white so much as decisionless. Drifts taught humility. Crust taught caution. Ice taught balance. She learned the road the old way, by missing it, by finding it, by knowing when to trust a fence post and when to find a cottonwood. If the sky went gray to the ankles, she counted steps. If the sky went black to the bone, she counted breaths. And if a storm erased direction entirely, she did what a route does when it forgets its own name. She became the name for it. There were nights, always nights, when Cascade's talk turned her into a fable faster than a person. Some stories grew antlers, and some grew teeth. The truth, less decorated, more durable, was that she worked. And work, when it is steady, makes a kind of quiet music. Sled runners singing on hardpack, a latch finding home, a child's feet on bare plank running to a door at the sound of knuckles. If there is a folklore in the making, this is how it begins. Not with miracles, but with repetition, faithful as a heartbeat. Meanwhile, outside the circle of her lamp, the larger country shifted on its chair. Railroads cut time into sharper pieces. Capital learned to move faster than weather. The news, when it reached Montana, arrived thinner, already translated like a song heard through a wall. But on Mary's route, the news still had weight, paper twine, and the human hand that brought it. The sisters kept their accounts, the ranchers kept their grudges, the river kept its shape. And the town kept looking up when she returned late or early, salted with snow or baked with dust, because a person who keeps coming back will eventually be believed. In summer brief, sudden generous, the root greened. Cottonwood leaves trembled like 1,000 coins. The ruts filled with light. Children kicked dust into weather of their own. She moved easier then, not because the miles were gentle, but because the calendar had finally decided to help. In fall, the colors went honest. The air sharpened, the haystacks grew shoulders, and every goodbye at a gate sounded like a promise to stay alive through winter. See you when the river wears glass again. And winter, long word, longer season, returned with its old vocabulary, drift, crust, glare, blue. A human being can learn any language given time, and she had. If you must have numbers, take these hired at 63. A star route that ran and ran. Years carried forward on ordinary days that history ignored until it couldn't. If you must have images, take these Mary. At the hitching rail, tightening a strap, as if the strap's behavior mattered to a child's December. Mary at the mission gate, nodding no fuss as the sisters receive what they prayed to receive. Mary at a door in the far dark, pausing while a woman unfolds news, the kind that lifts shoulders or breaks them, and then only then turning to the next name in the sack. Cascade changed around her false fronts, became truer. Barnes learned the trick of surviving. Boys grew into men and kept their hats in their hands, longer when she passed. But some things did not change the river's reluctance, the wind's opinion, the road's old hunger for footsteps, the town's appetite for stories about itself. She did not correct them. She did not explain. She stacked truth the way a body stacks wood, neatly, repeatedly, in a place you can find when the cold hits. So we set the stage, time, place, atmosphere forces in motion. A town that measured itself against weather and work. A country that measured itself against its own failures to remember. A woman who measured nothing, only distance, and then subtracted it. When we move forward, the facts will come like fence posts. You can count names, dates, ledgers, ad hoc routes, the bureaucracy that turned into a lifeline. And alongside those facts, the folklore will begin to whisper how a figure in a long coat stitched a scattered community back together. How a road that ended for others went on for her. How promises sealed in paper needed a body to arrive. And found one. Begin with the ledger, always the ledger. Because paper remembers what pride forgets. Star routes, those contractor lines carrying U.S. mail through distances the railroads refused or hadn't reached or couldn't hold in winter, were the nervous system of a country still learning its own hands. The government called them STAR for shorthand. Celerity, certainty, security. 3 promises reduced to 3 marks so a clerk could move faster. In Cascade, Montana, That promise had a shape leather script stamped, dates a route line scratched in ink from the post office door toward St. Peter's Mission, and the ranches stitched in between. No romance, just requirements, departures scheduled as if weather were obedient. Arrivals recorded as if roads were alive. Penalties listed as if a blizzard would apologize. This is the architecture of faith in a young nation paper first. People second. And then the weather, always the weather, grinning in the margins. Open the postal manual of the era, feel the stiffness of pages that never thawed. Contracts bid by the mile. Performance measured by days, not delight. A missed delivery could cost a week's profit. A consistent delay could cost the whole route. Some carriers used teams and sleighs when the snow came on heavy wheels, when ruts returned saddle, when the world narrowed to the width of a back. And some nights on the edge where arithmetic runs out, there is only a person and the parcel tied close to a chest. Because heat is also a form of logistics. The distance cascade to St. Peter's looks small on a drawing palm-sized a pretty lie. On the ground it bends, swells, disappears in fences, coulees, cuts in the cottonwood shade until a mile eats an hour. And the hour eats the nerve you thought you had. The numbers live where wind lives. Winter lows that skated past 0 and kept going. 20 below, sometimes more. Gusts that made a straight line lean like a question. Loads 20-30 pounds on a light day, 40 on a heavy growing. Heavier with each step, the way grief grows heavier when you speak it. Now name the carrier. Mary signed as Mary on receipts that did not leave room for biography. Past 60 bones, honest, stride, uncompromising. She put her name against a schedule and then made the schedule true. Fact witnesses remembered her starting before the town agreed it was morning, finishing after the saloons agreed it was night. Fact, the postmaster's ledger shows fewer missed arrivals than the weather would predict, meaning if you like plain talk, she was more reliable than Montana. Fact, she repaired harness with the calm of a field surgeon. Greased runners by feel not fashion, mapped the road in a knowledge older than maps. Wind vectors drift lines the sound ice makes when it remembers it is water. Fact, on a day when horses went lame and a sled stuck, she shouldered the bag and cut distance with a human diagonal across what the map calls open ground, which in winter is a euphemism for there are no witnesses if you guess wrong. Logistics in frontier terms is not a theory. It's a choreography of small, unglamorous decisions. What matters timing, leave early enough that failure has room to be repaired. Load discipline letters closest to the first door. Parcels wrapped to survive an insult. Balance the sack so one shoulder does not become an epitaph. Route intelligence fence posts as metronomes, willows as boundary markers, the lean of smoke as a compass. Contingency extra strap, extra lace, extra wick. Heat management wool under leather over nothing that surrenders to wind too quickly. The body becomes a warehouse of learned tricks, how to warm fingers without wasting minutes, how to breathe with a scarf so frost does not write on lungs, how to walk into gusts without letting anger decide your cadence, and the contract always a weight you cannot put down. The star in star route is a vow, and vows once made attract witnesses. Cascade watched. Some watched to see a spectacle, something to tell the next town, a woman doing a man's work, a story, to bring to a bar that had run out of coin. Some watched to see if letters would come an invoice that meant winter wouldn't close a ranch, a remittance that meant a January didn't have to be the end of a year. Children watched at windows with the same discipline you see in churches, faces lit by a hope they had not learned to hide. Every watcher adds a pound to the bag. Every believer removes one. This is also arithmetic. To put numbers to the memory if you need them, think in weeks, not days. A reliable run 3, 4, 5 days each week, depending on weather. Each round trip a tally of small victories, a latch lifted, a name pronounced correctly. A door that opens faster next time. Because trust once established shortens delays. Multiply by winters, subtract nothing. If the bag carried 20 pounds of paper, it carried more than that: births and debts and apologies and joy. Paper does not weigh much until it does. The town's economy, sinew, and ledger required the root. The mission, bread books, medicine required the root. The black community, small scattered, looking for proof that a nation's word could reach them intact, required the root. The sisters wrote in their neat hand. Ranch hands scratched in a braver script. Soldiers on garrison duty sent money home in envelopes that could not tell the cold to be kind. Mary became the difference between a rumor and a fact. In a country where black labor was too often written as invisible, she became visible by force of repetition. And repetition becomes reputation. It is here the folklore begins to whisper. Because repetition produces a rhythm, and people put melody to rhythm, whether they mean to or not. In the bars, the story grew shoulders, how she faced down a storm like an animal, and it backed away. How wolves kept to the coulees when her boots hit the road. How the telegraph line hummed a different pitch when she passed beneath. In kitchens, the story softened how she never left a doorstep without making sure a child's name was said kindly. How she kept one extra parcel of hard candy in the sack during holidays that were poor on purpose. And in the schoolhouse, the chalk dust settling like a light snow, the story standardized into a civics lesson. The government promises, the carrier keeps it. The children learn that promises are possible. None of this is provable by affidavit. All of it is provable by breath. Return to the facts, because the facts will survive winter. The star route specifications required carriers to provide their own equipment and animals. Failure to perform brought fines that did not care for excuses. Competition for contracts was a world where price shaved itself thin, and reliability had to make up the difference. She did not bid low because she was careless. She bid honest because she intended to finish what she started. When sleigh runners sang on clear ice, she moved like a metronome. When crust cut ankles, she moved like a verdict. She learned the small science of snow, how drift accumulates on the lee side of a fence, how wind carves cornices that look like invitations but are traps, how a faint glaze, the kind you can only see when the sky is a certain kind of gray, turns the ground into a second sky. No boot wants to meet. She marked those places in her head, and in a season or two, the route itself seemed to remember. Step here, not there. Slow now breathe. And yet, there were days when the system paper contract clock could not account for the truth of a person. A rancher hurt and alone, no one home but the stove. A sister at the mission sick with something the ledger had no column for. A child silent at first, then louder because grief has to raise its voice to be heard by adults. If you read the ledger, you will not find these lines. But if you read the town, you will. A carrier is asked to carry more than mail. A route becomes an artery. An artery saves what it can. She went with news and returned with responsibilities. She fixed things she did not break. Thawed pumps. Laughed in rooms that had forgotten how. Sat a minute on porches where minutes were expensive, because sometimes belief is the only thing that can be delivered on time. Cascades men, some of them preferred their stories with more gun smoke. But the clean truth of logistics is not cinematic in that way. It is cinematic in the other way. Point of view, low breath fogging lens, sound design full of leather talk and boot grit and a bag shifting its weight at each door. If you wanted spectacle, you could squint at the range and make a mountain into a cathedral. If you wanted consequence, you watched the post office on Tuesday. The postmaster, practical disciplined, did not clap when she returned. He counted. That is not coldness. That is confirmation. Numbers can be a form of respect when they are used to keep faith. Now pause. Listen to the edges of the story where folklore continues its work. A boy swears he saw her walk through snow up to her waist, without sinking child memory, but sincere. A woman says the wind eased when Mary lifted her hand, to knock physics perhaps, or prayer, or a timing the story decides to call magic. Old cowhands tell it like a joke, the blizzard had better boots, and then stop laughing because the punchline keeps breathing. None of this makes it into postal reports. All of it makes it into a town's sense of itself. Every community needs a yardstick taller than its tallest man. She became that yardstick, without asking. There is an economy of dignity in this work. Payment comes in coin, yes, but also in how a doorway opens the second time, in whether a man remembers to remove his hat, in the way children learn their future tense, the mail will come. In a century that wrote black life as an asterisk, Mary became the sentence unbroken declarative, repeated until no one could pretend not to hear it. The facts put their boots on each morning: departures, arrivals, signatures, seasons. The folklore keeps a lantern in the window. She is bigger than the storm. The storm knows it. And even if the storm forgets, she reminds it. If you want a diagram, draw 3 layers. Bottom the land, its unruly geometry, its winters that apprentice you to humility. Middle the system. Star route contracts penalties, schedules a bureaucracy that could be cruel or fair, but was always hungry for proof. Top the person, Mary, bridging what the land withholds and what the system demands. Remove any one layer, and the other 2 collapse into inconvenience at best, tragedy at worst. With all 3, you get a functioning promise. Mail is not romance. It is a supply chain for belief. Add one more figure to the page, the margin. In the margin are the Americans who had learned to expect their names to arrive late or misspelled or not at all. Freed people and their children migrating west for room. Black soldiers stationed on the high plains. Laborers who chose Montana because the word elsewhere had used them up. The difference between belonging and wandering can be as thin as an envelope, or as strong as the person who puts it in your hand. The record shows quietly, without adjectives, that Mary put a great many things in a great many hands. The town's stories, noisy, full of adjectives, say the same thing with more weather in it. So the facts stand, cold, sturdy, countable. A contract accepted. A route performed. Seasons met without dramatics until dramatics were the only option. A body that turned miles into minutes, minutes into proof. And braided through those facts, the first strands of legend, unspooling from doorways and bar stools and school benches, little children rehearsing the line as if it were scripture, the mail will come. In the next part, we will step inside those rooms, eyes level, breath warm, because numbers answer what and when, but faces answer why. For now, remember the arithmetic of faith, 3 stars in a manual celerity. Certainty, security, and one woman who made those marks mean exactly what they said. Again, and again, and again. Begin with a white room, not paint snow. A noon that looks like midnight turned inside out. Wind shaving the world down to one sound, the hiss of a thing, determined to erase. She steps into it. Steady. The leather bag pressed close, the strap biting like a reminder. You chose this, and you'll choose it again. Coolies vanish. Fence lines turn traitor. The road breaks into puzzles, drifts like ridge lines, cornices like invitations to fall. She counts steps in sets of 100, then gifts herself the grace of not counting at all. When the lamp glass ices, she keeps it close to her ribs to warm the flame back to courage. Somewhere behind her, a town writes odds on a chalkboard. Somewhere in front of her, a sister lights a second candle because sometimes light is not for seeing. It's for calling a person home. And between those 2 small theaters, the root, the old sentence that refuses to end with a storm. Another day, spring thaw, and the river is a creature again, bullying the banks, showing white teeth. The wooden bridge lists like an old sailor in bad company. A man practical to the point of insult tells her to turn back, mail can swim later. She shakes her head once the way you decline a dare you've already accepted. She unstraps the sack, double wraps with twine, pulls her coat tight, and scouts the gravel bar where the current splits around a stitched finger of land. Boots in up to the knee, then the thigh, then the cold, finds bone like it's reading a map. She leans into it, a slow letter written in water, one careful line at a time. On the far bank, the bag sheds droplets that look like a new alphabet. The man on the bridge lowers his eyes. The river keeps its opinion. She delivers 3 letters that evening and a tin of horehound candy left over from winter because sweetness, like courage, is best used before it goes stale. Summer tries another kind of test smoke. A brush fire 3 miles off paints the sky in the color of old copper. The scent creeps into everything. Sleeves hair the very grammar of breathing. She watches the wind west, then south, then west again. Reads it the way some women read faces. The telegraph sings a nervous song. The town cranes its neck without moving its feet. She rides the road that skirts the smoke voice in her head, reciting addresses like a rosary. At a gate she finds a girl with red eyes and a garden hose too short for the size of fear. Mary ties her scarf over the child's mouth, kneels eye level, says a sentence the girl will later repeat in her sleep. "You are not alone." Then the old rhythm, the rattle of latch, the exchange of names, the thump of the bag settling as its weight becomes the weight of a different day. Not all fires are bright. Some burn behind doors. On a late afternoon, heat heavy on the tongue, she walks into a silence so complete it has an echo. A rancher, gray as unlit ash, sits with a letter opened, but unread on the table. His glasses 5 inches away, patience farther. She stands still as a judge's pause. He nods a concession to dignity. She reads the letter aloud, slow, careful, with every comma, as if breath could be a balm. News of a son's recovery travels differently than news of a son's fall. Today it travels like a lifting weight. When she finishes, he sets his hand on the table and forgets to take it back, a sign of someone setting something down that should never have been carried alone. She folds the page and leaves it where he can find it again. Not all deliveries are about distance. Some are about returning a man to his own kitchen. The bar keeps its ritual. The chalkboard odds, the playful malice, the memory that shortens and lengthens to fit the appetite. She won't make it by Sunday, a man says, not with that ice. Another man, more careful with his speech, draws the figure on the window's condensation, a long coat, a square jaw, a line like a road. Watch, he says, and they do. When she passes the window 2 hours early, ice crust sparkling like borrowed jewelry, no one cheers. They do the older thing. They take off their hats. A wolf story circulates, because any land with enough winter will add wolves to its stories, whether the wolves agree or not. In this version, the pack keeps to the coulee shadows, polite as parishioners, and the carrier keeps to the fence line, parallel courtesies, observed by professionals who respect distance. A boy enlarges the tale until the animals are as tall as cottonwoods, and his father cuts the story down like hay. The pack was their son, and so was she, and the world continued. The truth is not a shortage. It is a steady miracle. People get to keep living. The mail gets through. Once the sled runner catches on a rock disguised as repentance. The jerk throws her forward hard, ugly, honest. She lies in the snow a second longer than pride allows. Then breaks the rules she keeps for herself and laughs. Laughter turns the cold from an enemy into an inconvenience. She tips the sled, clears the runner with a hatchet whose handle has the smoothness of years, resets the load, and marks the rock with a branch. So the next fool, possibly herself in 3 days, won't pretend the land has changed its mind. At the mission, the sisters ring a bell only she seems able to hear. Linen folded like snowdrifts on a small table. A ledger open to the page that matters. A patient whose name will not be spoken today, because speaking it would invite conclusions no one is ready to meet. She brings medicine brown glass cork, stoppered wrapped against breakage tagged in a hand, that believes in neatness. The nurse nods the way a person nods when they put a flame under water, and it stayed lit. On the way out, Mary waits longer than comfort, until she hears laughter through the door. Then she moves quiet because joy is more fragile in summer than in winter and shouldn't be startled. Autumn. The schoolhouse glows like a jar with fireflies. Children, the only creatures who watch with their whole faces, track the square shadow in the window. A boy darts out without permission 2 steps 3 and returns with a book no one knew had gone missing. Mary at the threshold shakes her head with the smile that forgives and instructs. The teacher notes the hour in the margin of a lesson plan, 12:17, because sometimes punctuality is the most teachable virtue. On the blackboard above arithmetic, a sentence appears the next morning. The mail will come. The chalk dust hangs like early snow. The town inhales. The story grows softer shoulders. Then a Christmas run, one of the famous ones, if fame can be measured by how many kitchens tell it the same way. Sled over glass bells muffled because sound travels oddly when the temperature is determined to keep secrets. In the sack envelopes fat with winter money. A parcel the shape of a doll. A letter in a thin hand with too many crossouts. A small tin that sings when it moves. She delivers the doll last on purpose because the day should end on a laugh that runs like water. The mother tries not to cry. The father tries not to be seen. The child fails to keep any of those rules, which is how the town learns, again, what celebration sounds like when it is earned. Counterpoint, because rising action needs backlash to sharpen it. A new bidder files for the root numbers, shaved to bone a promise written by ink that hasn't learned to pay its debts. The room where contracts are considered grows colder. Whispered arithmetic says cheaper. Witnessed arithmetic says hazard. She does not plead. She lists. Days made storms, outfigured penalties, avoided names pronounced. She is not selling herself. She is explaining the road. The decision lands where experience leaves it. The cheaper man leaves in cheaper boots. The road says it will see him again elsewhere. A quarrel in town, small petty volcanic to those inside it. A merchant claims a parcel never arrived. She tilts her head, listens again to the day. It would have come, finds in memory, a sound, a fence gate that squeaked a child in a red scarf, a rooster that did not belong on that porch. She names the wrong door. The merchant reddens. He had moved his notice buried under catalog pages no one asked for. The parcel is found, the apology issued, the road spared the indignity of lying for a man who misfiled himself. The telegraph fails 1 week storm, somewhere pulled-down wire singing the wrong hymn. The town cut from its line to the faster world, learns again the weight of local time. News moves at boot speed. Rumor tries to sprint and trips. She becomes temporarily the only courier large enough to carry a day. It is an old lesson dressed in a new coat. For all the country's improvements, some promises still require a human body that can learn bad weather and not take it personally. A final rise, because a story needs a ridge to see the next valley. The storm comes, one of those calendar writers, the kind the old men name like ships. The bar chalks a number no one believes and pretends to. The sisters fold blankets into squares that look like logic. The postmaster writes delay in a margin and then underlines it twice. She ties the strap, lights the lamp, steps into a page that will turn itself. Along the fence line, the wind scrapes its claws on the world. She leans until leaning becomes a gate. Breath in sevens, steps in tens. A gate latch that feels familiar under ice. A door that opens like it always knew how. And there inside a room, warmed by a small stubborn fire, a letter arrives exactly where it should. The rest of the route will take the rest of the night. The lamp's soot will leave its signature on the glass, and a town will sleep less lightly than it used to. In the morning, odds scribbled on a chalkboard look foolish under daylight. Hats tip by habit, not theater. Children repeat the lesson without chalk. The postmaster adds a mark to a ledger that has begun to read like prayer. Rising incidents are only incidents until they accumulate. Then they are proof. Proof gathers its own weather and carries it forward. Begin with the simple mechanic of survival, maintenance. Reliability is not a mood, it is a ritual. Each evening, whether she returned salted white with winter or dust brown with summer, Mary stripped the day back to parts. Harness off inspected stitch by stitch. Runners' flipped edges checked with a thumbnail until the burrs confessed. Lamp glass cleared of soot so tomorrow's light wouldn't inherit tonight's mistakes. Leather drank oil the way parched mouths drink water. Nails, straps, buckles counted, tightened, replaced before they were famous for failing. Nothing dramatic, just a doctrine of small mercies applied to objects until those objects repaid the faith. That is how reliability begins. Not with iron wills, but with quiet hands. Then, the body the most perishable machine, and the only one the root could not go on without. She slept when sleep presented itself upright, in a chair forward, on a table flat, on a cot, 30 minutes at a time, 2 hours when the calendar allowed. Food was fuel unburdened by romance, bread dense enough to be a tool, meat salted against betrayal, coffee strong enough to name its own weather. She layered wool under and leather over, kept hands dry as law traded speed for heat at the precise moment cold began to write its name inside her sleeves. The science was old, don't sweat. Sweat freezes, don't stop. Stopping is a letter to the grave, but the discipline was new each hour. Breath in account that the brain could keep even when thoughts turned to snow. Steps in sets, so the body felt it was winning a series of small wars rather than losing one large campaign. Training, if you insist on the word, came from the mission and the road together. St. Peter's had taught her the math of work plan the day, the way you stack wood by size, by need, by the weather you expect and the weather you'll get instead. Repair before regret. Pray while moving. Speak less than the hammer speaks. The road taught her what no house of teaching can, how to argue with distance without raising your voice. She learned where the snow lied, where the ice hid its opinions, how to read horses the way a nurse reads pulse ears' eyes, the twitch that says, not today, and the steadiness that says you have 1 more mile. She built redundancies the way a shipwright builds bulkheads, an extra cord inside a sleeve, a dry wick tucked into a seam, a map of warmer doors along the route, the kitchens where a carrier could thaw without paying with dignity. Doctrine, if we must call it that, was simple enough to repeat, difficult enough to keep. Leave earlier than pride suggests. Carry less weight than anger wants. Anchor the load so a surprise cannot unmake it. Think in contingencies, not excuses. When the river swells, probe, don't assume. When the wind angles, lean, don't fight. When the storm arrives with the vocabulary of an ending answer, with grammar not drama, knock name, deliver, withdraw, repeat. She made rules for herself and enforced them without spectacle. Never pass a fence line without choosing an exit if the world goes white. Never spend the last dry pair of socks except at the farthest door. Never promise a time you haven't earned 3 times already. Maps, imperfect, sometimes fanciful, were useful until they weren't. She built a second atlas under her boots. Landmarks that survive winter are different from summers. She memorized both. Cottonwoods that speak in wind are friends. Cottonwoods that do not are liars. A split boulder earns a nickname and keeps it for a generation. She gave them names functional enough to remember at a dead run. Telegraph poles became a metronome. Count 5 angle left, skirt the hollow that wants to be a lake in thaw. The discipline wasn't just knowing, it was rehearsing, so when panic came hunting, there were no lines to learn. Community quiet, unadvertised, became a network of warm spots in a cold map. A rancher left a lantern on a porch facing the road. Signal stove lit water on spare gloves in the box. A sister at the mission tied a blue rag to the gate on nights the wind needed someone to argue with signal, "If you make it here, you won't leave empty." A child chalked an arrow at the end of a lane after a drift erased the curve signal, "Turn now or meet the pond," pretending to be a meadow. Reliability is contagious when people are allowed to participate. She did not ask for favors. She made it possible for neighbors to be the sort of neighbors they hoped they were. Paperwork, the dull hero of a republic, underwrote all of it. The star route log didn't clap, but it remembered. Departures taken, returns confirmed, penalties avoided. She kept her own counters in head and pocket, so if a question arose, a fact was within reach, faster than a grudge. When the cheaper bidder reappeared, as cheaper bidders do, her numbers were a shield, her signatures. A map of faith, here, and here, she kept the vow. Here, during the storm that taught roofs to kneel, she kept it anyway. Reliability is not an adjective. It is an audit that passes. And the animals, because reliability is a team sport, even when you walk alone. Horses harden to the route like bread to a crust. She tuned them. No other word will do to the rhythm required, slower into glare ice, quicker, under whitening cloud where drift builds, like a bad habit, pause to listen, under a cut bank where avalanche dreams loud. She retired a horse 1 week earlier than her budget wanted, because animals deserve a good ending when they have carried your middle chapters. On true black nights, when the sky lowers until it becomes another piece of ground, she trusted the long memories of beasts more than the short memory of men. Why did it work out there, where things break for sport? Because she reduced risk, one small choice at a time, before risk became theater. Because she calibrated daily the trade between speed and safety, like a banker assessing a loan. Because she believed that dignity is fuel, not decoration, and offered it at every door. Names spoken right, faces read with care. Humor used the way you use salt sparingly to make the rest of the meal honest. Trust built roots into ropes. Ropes hold. The human factor, repeatable, teachable, spread. Children learned punctuality by shadowing her on porches. 2 minutes feels like an hour until the bag appears. Then it feels like proof. Men who measured themselves by wagers learned to measure themselves by kept appointments. The sisters at the mission used her timetable to ration medicine before it ran out. She used their ledger to sequence deliveries by urgency rather than alphabet. Systems shook hands, and a town stopped pretending that luck was anything but disciplined compassion-wearing boots. Now, the folklore deeper, darker, not to replace the facts, but to follow them like a harmony that makes the melody audible. They said the wind learned her name and said it back syllable by syllable when she crossed the flats at dusk. Mary, Mary. They said the bell at the mission chimed once, on nights she was 3 miles out, metal remembering a friend. Children half asleep at windows swore the lamplight around her took on a halo shape the storm could not enter. Old men tender, in the way only age permits, spoke of seeing her lay a palm on a skittish horse's neck and the animal settling as if the earth had tilted toward mercy. In kitchens where grief had rehearsed, they told of letters opened by hands that trembled and how the trembling slowed after her voice read the first sentence. None of this is testable. All of it is useful. Because folklore is a community's way of measuring what the ledger cannot, the repair of souls. Reliability in the wild required more than stamina. It required arbitration. She stood between the weather and the promise, the bureaucracy and the porch, the exhaustion and the last address. She made peace treaties with elements that do not sign paper. I will slow here. You will not take. I will lean now. You will not push. I will wait this hour. You will not turn hours into excuses. When the treaty broke as treaties with weather do, she did not bring grievance to work. She brought method. Reset the strap. Rewick the lamp. Reroute along the fence that does not move even when everything else is pretending to be a river. Consider the math of error, because no doctrine survives contact with a day. When she made a mistake, wrong gate, wrong lane, wrong hill in a landscape curated by snow, she did not add embarrassment to the load. She corrected as if correction were simply another address. She left notes in pencil where shame would want silence. Took the south path, drifted, doubled back, will compensate north tomorrow. Notes are generous. They allow the next person, often the same person, to inherit wisdom instead of weather. And the town, increment by increment, changed its posture from spectator to accomplice. A jar near the mercantile register marked "Route A coin here, a coin there," a silent acknowledgement that tax is paid for a system, but gratitude pays for the person. A blacksmith insisted on tuning runners at season's turn on the house. He called it calibration and pretended to despise sentiment. A widow kept a towel warming on a line above her stove. There are rescues only a towel can perform. When storms camped over the valley, the bar wrote odds less often and names more: who would check the west fence, who would sweep the church steps, who would sit up at the schoolhouse if the stove forgot its job. Reliability attracted responsibility. Responsibility redistributed winter. If you want one scene to put behind glass, take this. A night so cold, the air itself seems brittle. She arrives at a far gate later than anyone expected, earlier than is reasonable to find a man on the porch with his hat off and his fear on. Inside, a woman labors at delivering a child who has decided to choose tonight for arriving. Mary lays the bag down carefully, as if setting a boundary between two kinds of urgency, moves to the stove, coaxes flame from a sulking ember, boils water, tears a bedsheet into clean strips with the efficiency of someone who has been useful in rooms that would break other people. Hours later, child crying with the authority of a new law. She lifts the bag again, lighter somehow, though nothing has left it. When she returns to Cascade, the postmaster says nothing more than the word that matters: logged. The ledger absorbs the event as if it were an ordinary Tuesday, and maybe it was. Reliability makes miracles look like paperwork. Why it worked in 10 words you can carry in a storm repair early map: twice pace, breath, protect, heat, honor names. Add 5 more if there's room in your pocket. Let the town help. Reliability is not a solo, the carrier leads. The community harmonizes the system, keeps time. Each fails alone. Together, they sound like a promise kept. And as the folklore learns, the facts braiding itself tighter, it stops trying to make her a myth that erases her labor. The stories remember the oil on leather, the aching hands, the jokes spent like coins to buy back a room's warmth, the way she never let anger choose the route. In that remembering, the legend matures. She is not a saint of storms. She is the steward of a vow, human-specific, repeatable, which is better, because it means a town can learn her doctrine and keep it after the lamp goes out. When we step next into the inflection, the moment a whole place realizes it has been measuring itself against her, without saying so, we will count the turning points. The night the chalkboard odds vanished, the day the cheaper bidder became an anecdote. The morning the mission bell rang one extra time, because gratitude had found a rhythm. But for now, let the facts hold the center and the folklore light the edges. This is why it worked out there, where weather negotiates with bone, and why it mattered. Because in a country still deciding who gets their name delivered on time, she made the answer simple: everyone. If I have anything to say about it, begin with a barometer falling like a sentence that won't take a breath. A sky the color of old iron. A wind rehearsing its cruelty against door hinges and fence wire until both sing the same thin song. The old men name the storm, because naming is how you meet an enemy without panic. Blue north, someone says, and the name sticks like ice to a beard. The chalkboard goes up at the bar automatically. Odds times guesses, because ritual is a comfort even when it's wrong. A boy traces a line in the window's condensation coat hat, square jaw a bag, and his father does not correct him. Out at the mission, a bell is tested once, twice metal, speaking to air the way an anchor speaks to water. In the post office, the ledger lies open to the day, blank as a dare. The postmaster sharpens a pencil and sets it down, gently, as if any sharpness in the room belongs to the weather alone. And there, at a quiet table near the back of the room, where contracts are whispered into existence, the cheaper man returns. Ink, thin smile, thinner papers, folded into a hope he has not earned. He says words that sound like arithmetic bid, efficiency, cost, and the sentence ends on a number smug as a coin laid face up. He is speaking to the frost on the window more than to the men across the wood. A town that still pretends it likes bargains more than proof listens without leaning. Outside, the blue north arrives, not at once, but like an argument that will not let a house finish a thought. Mary is already moving, because doctrine is a promise you keep fastest when it is hardest to keep. Lamp-lit wick trimmed to a patient heart strap, tested, then trusted. She layers wool and leather as if dressing an idea in armor. The bag full of delicate weights settles into the shape of duty. She says the route aloud, addresses in order like a prayer that knows the pews by first name. Breath slow, steps slower, because speed breaks on glare ice, and there is no schedule worth a broken person. The door opens. The day narrows to a hallway of snow. 5 minutes out, visibility, a rumor she feels the world go flat, then tilted, then flat. The edge of town lost to the same white that stole 1,000 fences without malice. She leans into the wind, the way you lean into grief enough to stay upright, not enough to fall in love with the weight. Telegraph poles appear and vanish like forgetful saints. The lamp halo shrinks to a hand's width and then decides that is enough. She walks inside her own light. At the first ranch, a door opens, as if the house knows her knock before she lifts her fist. Names exchanged, always names, and a parcel that looks like a prayer wrapped in brown paper. Moves from bag to hand. Go on, the rancher says. Voice pitched low to keep from disturbing a child's sleep in the next room. She nods, breaths, steps. At the second gate, the latch is a fist of ice. She warms it with her palm until the metal remembers its job. Inside, a woman hands her an envelope and whispers, "If you can," as if possibility were a fragile bird that might fly away if startled. Mary touches the woman's shoulder once, a punctuation mark that says the sentence will finish. Halfway to the mission, a whiteout that erases even courage. The world simplifies into 3 facts, wind cold, and the memory of a fence line she cannot see. Doctrine, quiet, unadorned, speaks from inside her coat. If you can't see the next post, trust the last one. She backsteps to the previous certainty, resets her angle by the lean of a cottonwood she named 2 winters ago, counts 70 steps, and tests the dark with the lamp. A post surfaces like a remembered word. She breathes. Again, again. And the world offended allows one more proof. In town, the chalkboard is finally abandoned mid-odds. A man with a reasonable voice says, "We should go." Another says, "She won't want company." A third, quieter, kinder, answers, "Want's got nothing to do with weather." They gather rope scarves, the stubbornness men save for the days that will not grade them on charm. The bar empties like a bucket turned at a well. They are not a rescue. They are a witness, because sometimes a community must meet its example halfway to prove it deserves her. Across the flats, the storm drafts a different plan. A team 2 horses hitched to a doctor's light sleigh has gone lame or wrong, or just tired of arguing with a wind that doesn't share. The doctor hunches under a blanket, a bottle of medicine clutched like fragile law. The sleigh is half-ditched in a cutbank that will be a creek when the world remembers fluid. Mary hears it before she sees it. Not sound exactly, but an interruption in the storm's punctuation. She tips the lamp, finds the shape, and laughs once, the laugh that makes danger shrink to a size a person can lift. "Give me the reins," she says, voice low to keep from startling the horses into a memory of panic. The Dr. Gray, with cold and failure, obeys. Before a fence can find a foothold, she unhits the team with fingers that treat leather like a friend who needs to be reminded not to lie. She talks to the animals with the grammar of touch, neck withers calm, reties the load to a geometry that resists wind, and walks the sleigh out of its bad idea 1 inch, then 2. The doctor, watching her work, swallows a pride that is too expensive to keep. Medicine for the mission, he says when language returns. Yes, she answers, because sentences on nights like these should be shorter than the breath that must carry them. They move together, doctor behind horses, between Mary ahead, until the bell at St. Peter's breaks the storm for a heartbeat with metal certainty. The gate is half drift, half legend. She shoulders it open, not dramatic, deliberate, and they fall into a courtyard that smells like starch and relief. The sisters move like a practiced choir. One takes the reins, one takes the box, one takes the doctor's elbow with a firmness that tells him he is a patient today and not a profession. Mary sets the bag down in the vestibule carefully, always carefully, then stands a moment longer than necessary, eyes closed as if allowing gratitude to be a kind of heat. Back in Cascade, the rope line party meets her on the return, their hats iced into comic crowns, their faces young with cold. They do not speak heroics into the wind. They say the small words that save breath left gate step. When they reach the post office, the ledger is still open, the pencil waiting like a promise kept in miniature. The postmaster looks at her the way a man looks at a map that has finally admitted all its errors. He writes the time. He doesn't write anything else. Some acknowledgments belong to silence. Morning. And the storm has the decency to be beautiful after being cruel. Fences reappear as if summoned. Roof lines shrug off the weight they were not built to love. The bar's chalkboard is wiped clean by a boy who does not read what was written before. In the schoolhouse, the blackboard holds a new sentence. Someone's careful hand overnight. We measure by who arrives. Children read it aloud until the grammar becomes muscle memory. The doctor, thawed and properly irritable, admits to being escorted by a woman he had underestimated, then prescribes humility in small doses to the men who ask what saved him. The mission bell rings once more, then custom gratitude wearing a habit. Then the hearing, the little ceremony where towns pretend not to be ceremonies. Papers laid on a table, numbers on one side, weather on the other. The cheaper bidder clears his throat into a handkerchief that does not want his story. He says, cost. The postmaster, who has counted more storms than the bidder has seen winters, says penalty. The sisters say nothing but place on the wood a small bundle of receipts, deliveries logged at hours when the night believed it owned the calendar. A rancher says without drama, the difference between her and a number is the difference between my child living and not. The room quiets the way a church does when a child sings on key. The decision is not voted so much as recognized. The contract stays where it belongs. The cheaper man leaves by a door that feels smaller than when he entered. This is the inflection felt first in how a town opens its doors a half-second sooner. Heard next in the way hats come off without choreography. Seen finally in the absence of the chalkboard. Odds are for strangers, she is not a stranger. The folklore adjusts itself, less thunder, more detail. They tell the storm story without enlarging the wolves. They keep the doctor human and therefore grateful. They include the rope line men and the boy with the rag on the chalkboard because proofs are made in chorus. Legends become history when they learn to name everyone who kept the promise. Mary does not change her stride to match the town's new posture. She still repairs at night, layers at dawn, counts breath when the wind insists on arithmetic. But something in the air has shifted like a room where the picture finally hangs straight. The bar tests a new ritual. No odds, only names. Who's checking the west fence? Who's bringing a sack of coal to the school? Who's keeping coffee ready at the post office when the route runs late? The mission adds a second towel to the warming line above the stove because generosity is smarter when it plans ahead. The postmaster asks once if she wants the ledger to show more adjectives. She smiles. No. Numbers are dignified when they are true. Out on the road, the one that had claimed to be the end of a sentence and was wrong. The telegraph sings again. The wind, which has learned every language and forgotten none, says her name back to her in syllables the fence wire understands. She moves with the calm of a verdict delivered, and at a far door where a woman and a child wait with the extra quiet that follows fear. A knock sounds exactly when it should. The door opens. Names are spoken. Paper changes hands. Fear leaves by a different door. Welcome back to the road where the night never ended. And then did a little, because a town decided to share the weather. In that decision, the story crosses its ridge and sees its next valley. After this, we talk about what such proof buys that nothing else can. How a name kept arriving on time until the town began to keep itself on time. How a woman's route became a community's memory. And how memory, when it is honest, builds a future that even winter respects. Morning after the blue north. Fences showing their thin spines. Roofs shrugging off the last white sentence, the river thinking about motion again. Cascade wakes to a quieter grammar, less betting, more keeping. You can measure a town by how it behaves when the weather forgets to be cruel. And here the evidence is simple. Hats come off without theater doors, open a half-beat earlier, children watch the road, with a trust that sounds, if you put your ear to it, like a song learning its chorus. She walks as she always has. Lamp cleaned, strap checked, breath counted. And yet the air around her has changed key. A community that once measured itself against weather now measures itself against a woman who refused to treat duty as spectacle. That is Legacy's first footprint, small, certain, repeatable. The ledger quiet historian records it without adjectives. Departed, arrived, logged. But the lines between the lines lengthen. The postmaster guards the book like an altarpiece. The pencil lays down proofs as patient as a winter sunrise. The sisters write their own record in neat, unwavering hands, deliveries of medicine during storms that had no right to spare a door. A night when a stove found its flame again because a stubborn stranger decided a stranger wasn't what she would be. The schoolhouse keeps a different archive, chalk smudged loud with the arithmetic of punctuality and names pronounced properly. The mail will come, the children say, and then more quietly, almost to themselves, because she comes. Words become scaffolding for days that might have toppled. That is Legacy's second footprint, language changing shape to fit truth. In kitchens where grief rehearsed too often, letters lie folded and refolded, the way blankets are stored for a season that always returns. Some hold the ordinary courage of invoices and remittances. Some carry the fragile thunder of news that makes a spine straighten or curve. The difference measured over years is not weather, but certainty. A promise stamped with federal ink found a specific body to carry it. And a town learned that bureaucracy can become neighborly when a person insists on being the missing verb. The route, once a line on a map, thickens into a habit like prayer, like courtesy, like keeping the stove fed without being asked. That is Legacy's third footprint, systems remade gently in the image of one person's method. And the folklore, matured by contact with the facts, softens its edges and sharpens its names. Gone are the wolves as tall as cottonwoods. Kept are the parallel tracks in snow one late afternoon when professionals of different breeds agreed to share a distance. The storm keeps its appointed grandeur, but it no longer eats the people in the telling. The doctor remains human, embarrassed, grateful, instructive, in his honest admission. The rope line men become a choir of sensible courage. The bell at St. Peter's rings not for miracle, but for maintenance. A legend that erases labor is a theft. A legend that remembers labor is a curriculum. And that is what the town keeps curriculum, how to oil leather before it complains how to read the wind without theatrics. How to place a hand on a nervous animal and teach the earth to tilt toward mercy. Seasons turn again because they always do, and the root wears each like a familiar coat. Spring mud with its comedy of boots, summer dust with its appetite for throats, autumn's honest light, winter's long grammar. She ages in the way tools age, handle polished by use edge, kept purpose unconfused. Children who once pressed noses to glass now lift their own children to see the same halo of lamp, the same square set of shoulders, continuity you can point at. Men who once wrote odds switch to writing names on lists, coal for the school fence checks west. Warm towels at the mission labors made ordinary because the extraordinary was repeated into hum. Women who carried news in their rib cages learned that sharing weight is not a failure of strength. Churches pray shorter and act longer. None of this reaches a headline. All of it reaches a life. Beyond Cascade, the country changes as countries do fast in some places, stubborn in others. Rail lines knit tighter. Telephones begin to talk in wires longer than patience. Contracts for mail learn new acronyms and forget old stars. But even as logistics modernize, the metaphysics refuse to budge. Promises still need bodies. Bodies still need doctrine. Doctrine still needs rehearsal. 1,000 roots in 1,000 towns find their own Mary's men and women who make schedules into shelter, who treat names as fragile cargo, who consider dignity a form of heat. They will not all be remembered, but they will leave behind the same evidence, children speaking the future tense as if it were a right and not a wish. There comes as there must a day when she does not lift the bag. Tools are retired the way veterans should be. Honor first, silence afterwards. The town marks it without balloons. That would be the wrong grammar. Instead, the postmaster writes her name on a fresh page and closes the ledger with both hands. The sisters ring the bell once more than custom allows. At the schoolhouse, a child asks why the road looks different, and a teacher answers in the simplest words she has, because another pair of boots will learn it. The bar in one of its better hours keeps the chalkboard blank and the hats off. People bring stories like kindling and set them down side by side until the room is warm without smoke. A plaque appears years later, some committee finally catching up to what kitchens knew already. Letters cut into metal oxidize into the color of honest tools. The text is shorter than the life. That is the nature of plaques. But names matter, and hers does its work as surely as it ever did. Travelers read it and feel the old tug, the sense that a nation is a map of obligations made physical. Some take a picture and leave. A few look up, watch the road, listen for a rhythm they can't quite name. If they are lucky, a truck rumbles by on errands newer than letters, and they glimpse only a second the same shape of duty telegraphed into another century. What remains after the applause that never happened, after the arguments that finally lost interest, after the storms that aged into anecdotes, is the way a community learns to locate itself. We measure by who arrives, the schoolhouse wrote. The town adds an amendment. We also measure by who keeps arriving and what we do in the meantime. The ledger continues, different hands, same columns, and if you lean close, you can hear the scratch of pencil like sleigh runners on good ice. Children still press noses to glass. Doors still open at a knock they recognize. Names are still said correctly because that is a small, holy thing that costs nothing and pays out daily. And you watching from a farther porch? A different century, a screen that insists on being a window. What will you do with this road that didn't end? Maybe you keep time for someone who carries weight you don't see. Maybe you oil a hinge before it complains. Maybe you learn the wind where you live, its tricks, its moods, and stop treating weather as theater. Or maybe simplest, hardest, you speak names the way she did, carefully as if they were packages that could break in transit. Legacy is not a museum. It is a route ordinary, necessary, available to anyone who will learn the doctrine of small mercies and keep them on schedule. Welcome one last time to the road where the night never ended, until a town decided to share the weather. We've walked the hook, the context, the facts, the incidents, the quiet method, the inflection, and now the echo. Before you go, leave your witness. Tell us where you're watching from and the exact minute on your clock right now. Name a promise in your town that still needs a body. If this story carried something to your door, say so. If it warmed a room you thought would stay cold, light the next stove. The route continues. Because you do.